Aloha and welcome to the first lecture for anthropology. This is the first section of the anthropology introduction, and let's get started. So your readings for this section are the 3 chapters from Schultz and Lavenda, Cultural Anthropology. This lecture basically will look at chapter 1, or at least the first section of chapter 1, the anthropological perspective. The next lectures will discuss chapter 2 and 3, as well as the article by Renato Rosaldo, Grief and a Headhunter's Rage. You're also going to want to have read Charles Darwin and Claude Levi-Strauss from the 100 Essential Thinkers for this lecture. So we first, we're tackling social science by looking at the broadest social science. This is the the attempt of humanity to understand humanity, right? We're trying to understand human nature. We're trying to understand the ways that we come together and the ways that we form societies and groups and things like that. And it's not just current, but also, of course, understanding where we came from in the past forms of society and humanity. Yeah. So anthropology seeks to describe humanity in that broadest sense, right? So it's trying to identify all those aspects that all human beings share, yeah? So it's not just saying, what are the aspects that only females share or only Trobriand Islanders have or that sort of thing. The overarching goal is to say this is what humanity is, yeah? And so it's looking at all these different forms of humanity, all these different forms of society, all these different forms of behavior and that sort of thing, to try and understand all those things that we share, yeah, that make us the same. So the anthropological perspective then is holistic, it's comparative, and it's evolutionary. What we mean by holism is we're talking about basically this perspective that to understand humanity, we cannot reduce it to little subsections of information and that sort of thing. We want to understand it at that broadest, most inclusive level. Therefore, we need to be, as anthropologists, an integrative discipline. We need to draw from all these other fields that help to explain aspects of humanity. So biology gives us the understanding of our physiology and that sort of thing, as well as evolutionary theory. Geology gives us an understanding of what climates were like and what environments were like 100,000 years ago, 1,000,000 years ago, and that sort of thing. Political science we draw from to understand how society is organized and the issues of power and that sort of thing, and many different other fields, yeah. All inform anthropology because anthropology is seeking that highest level, most inclusive explanation, that one that explains all of humanity. So to do that, one of the things that anthropologists do is they compare. They look at different cultures and they explore basically those similarities and differences that exist between the Inuit Eskimos and the nomads in Iran and the Kalahari Bushmen and the New York stockbroker. All these different cultures need to be looked at to be analyzed. We need to understand how they're similar and how they're different, yeah. And not just currently again, but also we need to go back through as much time as we possibly can to look at our history and see where we came from and how these things evolved, yeah? So that leads us to that third component of the anthropological perspective, and that is that anthropology 100% basically accepts the evolutionary theory, and because evolutionary theory comes from biology, that's a bridge between the natural and the social sciences, yeah? So anthropological perspective is evolutionary. The anthropologist believes that not only have human beings genetically changed and physically changed, but our cultures change over time as well. And they co-determine each other. Yeah, we've gotten to a point where we sort of understand that our biology influences our evolution. Yeah, and it influences our culture. and our culture influences our biology. So because it's all sort of co-determined and interactive, we don't want to reduce it to separate little parts necessarily. Our the biggest goal is that most inclusive explanation of humanity. So the anthropological perspective, or anthropology, basically includes the notion of culture. Yeah, culture is seen as a system of behavior, or as varied systems of behavior and varied systems of meanings that we human beings use not only to communicate but also to adapt to our environment and to improve our lives, to improve not only our lives but those lives of the people around us. Yeah. So we'll see how that works. And when we talk about evolution from the anthropological perspective, there, anthropology includes not only biological evolution, which talks about, genetic change and continuity among humanity, that we are basically, passing on our genes to the next generation and that sort of thing, but also the notion of cultural evolution, where we basically believe that societies change, that the meanings and the values and beliefs of a culture will adapt over time. Yeah, and cultural evolution talks about all those things that we don't inherit from our parents. These are not genetic things, but rather this is information that is taught. Yeah, so you don't inherit it; you learn it. Yeah, learning is a key aspect of what differentiates human beings. So Chuck Darwin, or as his friends call him, Bobby. Yeah, this is Charles Darwin. He is, the master of evolution theory. He is the gentleman from which we get this wonderful parsimonious explanation of how we get varied species in our environment. So his explanation of natural variability and evolution was explained in his text on the origin of species by means of natural selection. This grew out of other work that was being done in economics and political science at the time, specifically the Malthusian doctrine, which comes to us from Thomas Malthus. He was a parson who believed basically, or who could show actually, that the world was heading towards overpopulation. Yeah, he looked at the census that was done in America, the very early, very first census, and he saw that the population in America had doubled. Yeah, in 25 years. So he used that basically and said, well, I think that's probably a good guess as to what happens around the world. Pardon me. So Malthusian doctrine states that the population is going to increase at an exponential rate, and our ability to feed our population does not increase at an exponential rate. So if our population is left unchecked, we're going to wind up with famine and death, and we won't have enough food to feed folks. So that gets Darwin thinking about what is it that is gonna that makes a difference between those who win in the competition for resources and those who lose. And that, and of course all of his individual observations where he's seeing animal species with just a little bit of a difference, and fossils on mountaintops and that sort of thing, which led him to guess that maybe the world hadn't always been the way that it was. So with evolution theory, Darwin's key insight is basically the ability to explain simply how extremely complex organisms could arise without the need for a designer or a god or that sort of thing. So where does this come from? Well, it comes from his notion that evolution theory is just saying that there's natural variability within all species. Yeah, and what he's talking about basically is reproductive variability. Every time two organisms join together and reproduce, what's happening is, although he didn't know it, happens is we get a shuffling of the genetic deck, right? Our DNA is what combines basically to produce a child or to produce an offspring. Well, it doesn't combine in a linear, explainable fashion. The way that it combines basically is sort of a random combination. So, although there are things like, we have ideas about dominant and recessive genes and that sort of thing, the combination, when we reproduce, when any organism reproduces, when they join together their genetic material, you can't plan necessarily for what's going to come out. There is variability every time we do that. Sometimes your kids are a little bit taller, sometimes they're a little bit shorter. Some may have brown eyes, some may have blue eyes. And then sometimes there's a mutation that makes it easier for a group to survive based on their environment. Sometimes it's a mutation that has no effect, and other times it's a mutation that actually makes it harder for them to survive. So it's natural variability. Every time any two organisms get together and mate, the child comes out with the possibility of new variations, right? So when we're talking about evolution theory and genetic evolution, we're only talking about what's called heritable variability, and what that is genetic variability, yeah. So the overall basic explanation of evolution is that what determines survival is the interaction between what an organism has, the attributes of an organism, their smarts, their strength, their speed, all those things, yeah, and the demands of the environment in which that organism finds itself, yeah. So, for example, it doesn't matter, if your environment says, is saying that you've got to be able to go long periods of time without hydration, yeah. It doesn't matter if you're the biggest, strongest organism in the area. You're not necessarily going to survive. The organism that's going to survive is that organism that has the ability to go the longest without hydration, without water. Yeah. So it's not a question necessarily of biggest and strongest and that sort of thing. It's a question of fit between the organism and its environment. Yeah. The better an organism fits its environment, the longer it will live, and the more it will reproduce, which means it will inject its genes into the gene pool at a greater rate than those that die earlier. And that is the key, basically, to evolution theory. So we hear a lot of the terms of survival of the fittest when you hear about evolution, yeah? And it's important for you to understand that evolutionary fitness is determined on the basis of reproductive success, okay? Evolutionary fitness does not mean the biggest gorilla or the strongest whale or the most aggressive members of a species, whatever they are most fit. Yeah, that's not what evolutionary fitness means. It means that the members of a species who reproduce the most are considered the best fit. To reproduce the most, you have to survive. Yeah. So the ability to survive may involve many other things besides being big and strong, right? The ability to survive might involve the ability to hide, and the smartness, the ability to sort of recognize and say, hey, that's a big, strong, bear or lion or whatever. And rather than try and kill it, I need to hide from it, let it go past me, and then survive to mate another day. So it's not just strength, it's the ability and recognition that there are threats in the environment and being able to solve these adaptive problems that allow us basically to survive. Yeah. So, probably the biggest and the strongest member, if they thought, they were going to kill that lion, they probably got ate first, and then the other folks who are maybe less impulsive got to survive. Yeah. So, but the key here is when we talk about survival of the fitness and evolutionary fitness, has nothing to do with strength, has nothing to do with size. It has to do with the ability to survive long enough to reproduce. The more you reproduce, the better fit you are, because you wouldn't be alive if you didn't fit into that environment, and therefore you wouldn't be able to reproduce. So another thing that we talk about in evolution is what's called an adaptation. We're talking about how organisms, change over time and become these incredibly, specific, complex beings, right? Well, so evolution has to explain that, and it does so with the notion of adaptation. Adaptation is any change in the structure or functioning of an organism that makes it better suited to its environment, that allows it basically to survive longer, to reproduce more. Yeah. Process of adaptation leads to changes in an organism, and also it impacts their environment, which we're going to see. When we're talking about adaptation with the human species, we're able to adapt not only biologically, for example, things like bipedalism, walking upright, as we see in this cartoon from Gary Larson. The notion of changing our structure, changing our functioning to better suit our environment. Well, walking upright allows us now better vision, better ability to see around us, and also better ability to use our hands for manipulating objects and those sorts of things. But we don't just adapt biologically, we also adapt culturally, and we're going to take a look at what that means. But first we need to talk a little bit about natural selection. Natural selection is that process, basically, that says that nature will select the best organisms in the environment to survive. Those who are not the best fit will die off sooner. Yeah? So natural selection, the idea that the giraffe with the longer neck, who can reach more food, will survive longer, reproduce more than the giraffe with the shorter neck. Because it reproduces more, it sends its genes out into the gene pool, and there's a greater likelihood that the giraffes that are its offspring may have a longer neck as well, right? And of course, this happens over dozens of generations. So natural selection results in adaptation, but not necessarily optimization. And what that means is that we have all this variability, right? And some of that variability is not necessarily the best. Yeah. Sometimes we have adaptation or a mutation that basically means that the organism can't see as well as other organisms. Yeah. And then it doesn't live as long. Yeah. Adaptation doesn't mean better. It just means change. Evolution. Nature doesn't have an end point. Yeah, there's no end point to evolution, and there's no guiding philosophy there. There's no one there picking and choosing. Yeah, so evolutionary change is not necessarily predictable change, and it's not necessarily desirable change. It's just change that fits the environment. Sometimes it fits better, and the organism lives longer. Sometimes it fits worse, and the organism dies off. Yeah. So natural selection results in evolutionary change, but it's not necessarily always getting better. Yeah, it's just different, and sometimes that difference is good. Sometimes that difference is worse. Sometimes that difference has no effect. Yeah. So remember that evolution is opportunistic. Evolution responds to environmental change. It works with the available raw material, which means genetic variation. Yeah. And what that means in part is that organisms with a long history of survival, such as Homo sapiens, we've got millions of years in which we've co-evolved with our environment, where, pardon me, there have been what we call population bottlenecks, and we'll talk about that. And basically the notion is that severe sudden climate change has placed human species in a position where they've had to be able to adapt in that generation to their environment. Without doing so, they would all die. So the only ones who survived basically are assumed to be those who adapted. Yeah. Evolution can solve the same problems in different ways, right? So we see, like, there are different ways of flight. There's the bat wing, which is actually the bat's hand, yeah, and it's a spread of skin between the fingers, and the skin actually connects to the bat's side, right? Versus a bird wing, which is also, of course, the bird's arm, but it is not a collection of skin. It's instead what used to be hairs that grew and formed and basically became feathers, right? So we see that there's not one necessary answer to a problem. Yeah, evolution is just this wide roll of the dice. Yeah, and basically, we've got these huge groups of species that are reproducing over and over again, and that reproduction is interacting with the environment. And sometimes that reproduction produces offspring that are a better fit for the environment. They have a much greater chance of survival to reproduce, and much greater chance of reproducing at a faster, or rather at a greater rate. They will reproduce more than those without that adaptation. Yeah. When they do so, their genetics are then injected into the gene pool at a larger rate, and it's assumed that those things will continue as long as it's a better fit for the environment. Yeah. So again, it's opportunistic, and we'll take a look at what we mean by that. So Darwin, is seen as as such a revolutionary thinker, even though he wasn't actually the first person to come up with this. But he's basically, when he comes out with this evolutionary theory, we see this gradual paradigm shift between divine creation and this idea of forms, the theory of forms and such that came to us from from the Greeks, to basically this other sort of explanation, and this other explanation that doesn't require these extra assumptions of a creator or anything like that. Yeah. So Darwin's able to show that the differences between a bat and a bird and a dog and a cat and a human being and a chimpanzee are due to descent by modification. The influence of modification is time and environment, right? It's over time that our species reproduces, and that gene pool is affected by the environment, and there's this basic sort of what works will survive and what doesn't work will not. So he said what looks like design is really just the survival of inheritable qualities through these multiple generations. We see, again, the giraffe reproducing, and with the longer neck, because it lives longer, it can eat more food, reproduces more, sends its genes out into the gene pool. They, those offspring, if they have a little bit longer neck, might be able to reach more food, might be able to live a little bit longer, reproduce more, and it just continues on and on and on, right? Until, of course, the environment changes. Maybe it's no longer, a good fit to have a long neck. Maybe all of a sudden all the food becomes bushes on the ground instead of trees, in which case the longer neck giraffes will slowly die out, and the shorter neck giraffes would increase in size, right? So the reproduction rate of any generation depends partly on the traits of that generation or of that specific individual, and partly on the environment in which that individual has to fit. Yeah. So we're talking about traits and the fit of those traits with the environment that determines whether or not we will survive and whether or not our genes will be passed on. Anthropology also takes in the concept of culture. Culture is basically, what we learn from the day we're born. Culture is a system of meanings and a system of justification that provides us not only with the understanding of music and math and politics and all those sorts of things, but at an even more basic level, it serves our evolutionary function for survival. We've gotten to the point that human beings cannot survive without culture. Yeah. So, and I'm not just talking about human babies who are left on their own, right? We learn, so yeah, let's say you take a 3-month-old child or a 9-month-old child, or heck, even a 2-year-old child, and you say, okay, you're on your own now. find your own food, find your own shelter, and all that sort of thing, kids are going to die, right? Well, uh, so part of our culture is we need to be able to care for our children. There needs to be an understanding that you don't just leave your kid once you've had them. Instead, we have to raise them and teach them and all that kind of stuff, right? Well, but it goes beyond that. Here's how deep our culture is. Our culture is so deep that if you take a human being and you raise them without culture, where we see, these feral children who are, given food or, and some basic ability to survive, but are locked in a room away from other people, not allowed to learn language and those sorts of things. They don't, they aren't human. Even if, you pull that, it's been a couple of different cases where, children were, treated to horrible abuse and neglect and things. And, because they didn't have social interaction, they didn't learn language, they're these stunted beings. Yeah. They don't, it doesn't come back. Yeah. You get them at age 15 after all this horrible trauma and abuse, and it's almost impossible to teach them language. It's almost impossible to teach them culture. Yeah. So human beings need culture to be human. Yeah. And so your text talks a bit more about that. Another aspect of our culture is how fast our culture now evolves. Yeah. It used to be that biology was the evolving thing, and culture didn't change as rapidly. But as time has gone on and technology has improved, and now we've gotten to a point that human culture changes rather than human biology. Yeah. So, for example, we used to have to adapt ourselves to our environment. Yeah. But now we adapt the environment to suit ourselves. Yeah. So, for example, you go out to Abu Dhabi, which is this hell desert, wasteland, with no water, no trees, just this horrible desert. You go out there now, and it's this booming city with amazing architecture. Yeah. And it's because our culture has evolved so much that we've got the technology and the power to put water in the desert, to put buildings in a desert, and to pump them full of air conditioning. So now we can survive in a place that used to be a desert wasteland. Yeah. And we do that through technology. Where does that technology come from? From our culture. Yeah. So much so that our survival now is culture bound. Yeah. We have culture bound survival skills that teach us how to survive in our culture. So here in the West, we know how to get food, how to make a living, how to get shelter and form relationships and those sorts of things. But take us out of our culture, put us in a place with no culture, and now we've got to figure out how to survive. We can't just go to McDonald's with our debit card and order a cheeseburger or whatever. We now have to deal with the world and find a way to survive that isn't culture bound. If you send us, and it's so interesting to us that we actually make TV shows about it now, right? Survivor. Let's send folks out to a desert island and see how they deal with it, and of course see what kind of horrible social things erupt and that sort of thing in this situation. So here's an example of how human beings adapt culturally. These terraced rice fields in Bali. Yeah, there's a mountainous tropical environment, and you cannot, you can't grow plants on a hilltop or on the side of a mountain. But we learned that you can terrace. Yeah, you can make small plateaus. One higher than the next or one lower than the next, basically, and transform the side of a hill into rice fields. Yeah, and that's cultural adaptation. We develop ways of doing things that are compatible with our resources and with the limitations and the things that the environment provides to us. Yeah, so we need to grow food. We develop this sort of domestication and agriculture and such So rather than say we can't grow food here because there's too many mountains, we're able to adapt our environment and say now we can grow food here because we've made terraces. Yeah. And these adaptations can last. They can be remarkably stable for long periods of time, even thousands of years, and then they can change almost automatically. We used to do irrigation in the West with these long hoses and such, and we'd have these big squares of farm fields and things, and we'd irrigate using this basic sort of notion of flood irrigation and that sort of thing. Well, we've come up with a better way of doing it. Yeah, even though we did flood irrigation for hundreds of years, possibly centuries. Now, if you fly over the Midwest and you're able to look down and see the fields there, you don't see big squares anymore. You see giant circles. Yeah, and the reason that you see giant circles is because they've changed the way that they irrigate the fields. This is a new adaptation. It's a better adaptation. It allows them to water more quickly, and it saves time, saves energy, saves money. Yeah. So once this adaptation basically gets picked up and we see that it's functional, it can spread through our culture like wildfire. Yeah, like an iPhone does. Yeah, and that sort of thing. So we can look at some of the cultural adaptations of prehistory. Yeah, one of the universal types of human adaptation is what's called foraging for food. Yeah, it's this is the majority of our ancestry basically was spent in hunter-gatherer groups of roughly about 100 people or so. Yeah, 99% of human history has been spent in these hunter-gatherer groups. Yeah, and what we did back then basically was we needed to migrate to find food. Yeah, we would move basically when it's cold. We'd move down south, get the food there during the winter and that sort of thing. When it gets heated up in the summer, we'd move back up north to where it's more temperate and that sort of thing, and find our food up there. Well, uh, and that lasted for we assume millions of years, and we didn't actually see domestication of plants and animals developing until roughly about 10,000 years ago. Yeah, so we lived, I mean, our history is mostly these hunter-gatherer groups, and that's an important point, because what we are now is due to our long history in these small nomadic social groups. Yeah. So once we started with domesticating plants and animals, that means basically learning how to grow plants, learning how to contain animals and raise them and slaughter them and use them, as stationary resources rather than having to go out and find them each time. We started to get more permanent settlements. Once we started with horticulture, once we started with this sort of notion of, I can plant a field, but I need to be here to harvest it, and that sort of thing. You need to stay there. We've also got this notion with this domestication of plants and animals of what's called pastoralism. That still required mobility because, here we're talking about herdsmen, yeah. And so their notion is basically we need to be able to move to allow the herds to feed, right? They've got to graze in the pasture, and we've got to find them water and that sort of thing. Once they eat all the grass in this pasture, we need to move them on to another one. Otherwise, they'll starve. Yeah. So it's only been the past 10,000 years that we've really seen a rapid sort of change in this progress, where we see domestication of plants and animals. We see horticulture, agriculture, and those sorts of things, and then cities begin to develop somewhere roughly around 5,000 years ago, and from there it just gets faster and faster and faster. Now to the point where people are saying are anticipating the different ways that things are going to change, just in the next 10 years. Yeah, that we'll be able to do things like communicate, as we actually can. With the iPhone, you can look and you can see the other person on your phone, and they're talking to you. It's a video phone, yeah. And so these this pace of technological improvement continues to speed up. So we can take a look at the differences between genetic evolution and cultural evolution. Pardon me. So, most folks think about evolution in terms of the biology. And so when we say genetic evolution, we're talking about the product of natural selection, that organisms that are a better fit for their environment are selected for survival by nature. Yeah. When we're talking about cultural evolution, we're talking about, instead of natural selection, we're talking about learning. Yeah. Cultural evolution is the product of learning. It is the transmission of acquired behavior characteristics from one generation to the next. Right. So when we talk about genetic evolution, it comes from Darwin. When we talk about cultural evolution, that comes from a gentleman named Lamarck. Yeah. The genetic evolution is innate. It does not get changed during the organism's lifetime. What changes is when the organism reproduces. Half of their genetic material gets mixed with half of the other organism's genetic material. You get a brand new organism that comes out. Yeah. But cultural evolution, yeah, that does get learned. It modifies during your lifetime. Yeah. So, you get taught, it's important, you teach your children, it's important to share. Yeah. It's important to cooperate. That's what Sesame Street is all about. We cooperate and things get better and we share, we share our toys and so on and so forth. Well, as children grow up, they can learn that sharing is important, but it's not always necessarily the most important thing. Yeah. So for example, they say, oh, well, I want to share, and because my parents tell me that's important. So they share, and what they wind up with is, getting bullied to share more, that sort of thing. And so they learn, it's not just about giving everything that you have. It's also being able to negotiate and being able to say, I will give you half of this sandwich for half of your apple or whatever. Yeah. So the cultural information and cultural behavior can change. It's learned during the lifetime, and it can be modified during the lifetime. Genetic material is passed on through hereditary information. Yeah. So we do not pass on to our kids by writing something in a book. We don't write our genes down in a book and give it to them. Yeah. What happens is we reproduce. We have an offspring, and our genetic information is now encoded in that offspring, along with half of the genetic information from our spouse. Yeah. Cultural information here is passed on to kin, social group, population, that sort of thing. Your information basically can be shared not only within a generation but between generations. Yeah. Genetic evolution is inherently slow. Yeah, because what we're talking about is reproduction, and reproduction takes time. Not only does one single reproduction take time, but we're talking about change among a population group, among a species. So we're talking about generations of time. Yeah. So that is necessarily very slow change. Whereas with cultural evolution, we can see very fast change. Yeah. It's still, like for example, a good example is there's a movie that was very popular a year or two ago. I believe it was called The Hangover. And there's a gentleman, Zach Galifianakis character in The Hangover, who walks around with a beeper. Yeah. And it was just, like 15 years ago when beepers were the cool thing to have because nobody had cell phones. So to contact somebody, you call their number and they'd have this little mechanical thing that beeped on their belt loop or whatever, and then they'd know, someone's trying to get in touch with me, and they go to they go to a payphone, and they call that number. Yeah. Well, it's a joke now. If somebody has a beeper now, we laugh at them, and that's the whole point of that film, because now everybody has cell phones. Why would you need to call somebody on a beeper when and have them call you back when all you have to do is call them on the cell phone? You can talk to them right there. And if you both have iPhones, you can see each other while you're talking. So that's, necessarily very rapid change. And that'll do it for the end. This is the end of the first part of the initial lecture for anthropology. If you have any questions about your reading or about this lecture, please feel free to give me a call or email me, and we'll see you on the next lecture.